You can take your Bibles and go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. A few weeks ago, kind of leading up to Thanksgiving, throughout the month of November, we were teaching on something on the theme of thankfulness, but I sort of kicked it off with sharing a record in the Old Testament about David and his day of Thanksgiving when he brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. This evening, I'm going to teach the record that's probably David is most well known for. The record that people that have never read the Bible, if they've ever heard of David, this is the record that they've heard about. And it's such a wonderful record. And it's one that, sometimes I think because it's such an exciting, inspiring record, and it's one that oftentimes parents teach their children, that sometimes people forget to look at this or perhaps don't look at it often enough. It's a record that is very familiar to most people, but being familiar doesn't make it any less inspiring when you actually look at the record. And it's the record of David and Goliath. And we'll pick this up in chapter 17. David has been introduced at this point. He has been introduced when the prophet Samuel goes to his father's house to find a new king because the first king, Saul, has no longer proven himself to be worthy to be king. And God has told Samuel to choose someone else. And he anoints David, when David is still just a boy, to be king, although David doesn't move into that role, functioning in that role for quite some years. But in between that event and his actually ascending to the throne, there's this great record of his battle with Goliath. And in chapter 17, in verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle." The Philistines are kind of Israel's arch enemies at this point. "And were gathered together at Shokah, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokah and Azekah and Ephesdammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines." So you've got these two armies. They're both pitching. Doesn't mean they're playing ball games here. They're pitching camp, and they've set up. And you've got these two armies who are on opposite sides of a valley, as we'll see in the next verse. "And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them." So you got the picture? All right, verse 4. "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath." He was the champion of the Philistines. And that goes back to the original meaning of that word champion. Now it's somebody that gets to be on a box of Wheaties. I don't think Goliath was on the box of Wheaties. The original meaning of a champion was the one who would fight to represent that entire army. And sometimes when armies came out like these two armies have, and they're getting ready to battle, they will say, "Hey, instead of everybody coming down and fighting, you pick your best guy, and we'll pick our best guy, and just those two will fight. The champion of our nation and the champion of yours. And whoever wins, he'll win it for the entire nation." That's what Goliath was. And you can see why they liked this guy for the role. It says that his height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, 6 cubits and a span, what's a cubit? A cubit was the measurement from your wrist to your elbow. And because it's an inexact measurement, you'll find when you look this up, different measurements that they come up with, calculate this out to be. Here in my Bible, there's a note that it says it's 9 feet, 9 inches. A span was the width of the hand. So he was 6 cubits in a span. So this is saying that's about 9 feet and 9 inches, give or take a foot or two. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. He wasn't working for the post office here. It's not that kind of mail. Coat of mail, like the mail armor, the chain mail. That's the word. Yeah, chain mail. Not a chain letter, but chain mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. My note says 166 pounds. That's a heavy coat. My wife doesn't like anything that's like more than a feather. This one's 166 pounds that he's wearing. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him. So here he is in all of this armor, and if he didn't feel like protected enough, he's got another guy who just carries this shield in front of him. He is a monster. This is somebody that you can't blame everybody that you'll read about shaking in their boots when they look at this guy. He had to be quite an imposing figure. You probably would not have wanted to get in a ring or a cage match with him, right? Well, that's the way everybody in Israel felt, as you'll see. Verse 8. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? That great Saul, this king that you're all always bragging about? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. So there he is. He comes out with all, his impressive height and all this armor and everything else. And there he says, send somebody down. Come on, we'll fight. Whoever wins, that'll be it. Now, you keep that in mind, okay? Because later on, as we read about this, you'll see that that's not quite how everybody feels once things go down the way they do. So there's the challenge. There's the challenge. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they said, okay, I'll take you on. Saul said, I'm the king. And besides being the king, I'm the biggest guy in Israel. Because that's the description of Saul. It says that Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else in Israel. So, and this was back at a time when, kings led their troops into battle. Not when they were sitting back in Washington, D.C. and just making up the plans and sending them in. He should have been the guy that led them into battle. He should have been the one that did it. But it says that he, along with everybody else, was freaked out. Wow. He was dismayed and greatly afraid. They were shaking in their boots. They were all shaking in their boots. And if you look at it from just a 5 senses level, it's easy to understand why. Sometimes when you know the outcome of the story, it's easy to kind of think, why those cowards? What's wrong with them? But if you were there, what would you do? How would you feel? Verse 12. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he, Jesse, had 8 sons. And the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. Jesse, the father, was an old man. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of the 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So that's what David does. He's a shepherd. He's a shepherd, and he's the youngest. And somebody's got to stay home and take care of the sheep. Somebody's got to take care of the property. And that falls on David being the youngest. He's the only one of them that would have been willing to fight, as we'll see. And it's interesting to see how this all plays out when you consider what happened when Samuel did go to pick a king, because all these guys that they're naming were all the ones when Samuel first looked on them, he thought, boy, now this must be the one that God picked, because if ever somebody looked like he should be king, why, it's old Eliab here. He looks like he's just fit for the job. Verse 16, and the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself how many days? 40. 40 days. And there's again that significant number, 40. Always a time of trial. Always a time of testing. And here for 40 days, Goliath is doing this. Verse 17. And Jesse said unto David his son, take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp of thy brethren. And carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Go check out on your brothers, see how they're doing. Give them some lunch, see how they are. Verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose up early in the morning, and left the sheep with the keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. That wasn't one of these deals. He's greeting them. He's, said, Dad sent the stuff. He wants to know how you're doing, so on and so forth. And as he talked with them, verse 23, behold, there came up to the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the army of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. He gives the same little spiel that he's been given for 40 days, every day, challenging them. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and were what?
Sore afraid.
They are all running, to change their drawers. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And yet with all of that, with the riches, with the king's daughter, with the position, with the favor, everything else, he can't find any takers. He can't find anybody that's willing to do it. And David spake to the man that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's got a bit different attitude than the rest of them, doesn't he? Yeah. He can't believe that the king's even making the offer. He can't believe that he would have to do that. David's attitude is, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. He's mad. David's making them look bad. He's making them all look bad because he's not trying to. But David can't believe that somebody wouldn't just already have accepted this challenge. And so he turns on David and says, what are you doing here anyway? Who's taking care of the sheep? You shouldn't be here. You just wanted to come out and see some action. Verse 29. And David said, what have I now done? You can tell he's a kid because that's just what a kid would say, right? What have I done? What's wrong? Isn't that a cause? What's the problem? Verse 30. And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. David can't believe it. He's got to hear this from somebody else. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul. And he, Saul, sent for him. So people are talking to Saul and saying, can you believe it? There's this punk kid who's making us look like fools saying, why, I'd do it. Verse 32. They rehearsed him for Saul, and he sent for him. Verse 32. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Everybody doesn't have to be freaked out. I'll be happy to go do it. I'll be happy to go fight this guy. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. For thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. You're just a kid. And he's been a mighty soldier since the time he was a kid. And David said unto Saul, let me tell you a story. Thy servant, speaking of himself, kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. He might have been a kid, but he was a pretty brave one who had already proven God in his life. One who had a responsibility to take care of these sheep. And he didn't do it on his own strength. He didn't do it just on his own ability. He did it trusting God. And he so cared for those sheep that when a lion and a bear came, rather than run the other way, look for higher ground, he went right after that lion and right after that bear and grabbed him by that lion by the beard and killed him. That's what David did. Verse 37. David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion. Who delivered him out of the paw of the lion? Lord. See, he didn't do it. He didn't think, he wasn't cocky. He wasn't so, sure of himself. He was sure of God. He was confident in God. He trusted God. And it didn't matter what he was up against. It didn't matter how ferocious the opponent, how absolutely a moment staring death in the face the situation was. He trusted God. He trusted God and he didn't freak out. And that's why when this giant Goliath is making all his noise, David's the only one that's not freaking out. It goes on to say in verse 37, that same Lord, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, go, and the Lord be with thee. He convinced him. He said, then you go ahead and do it. He must have convinced him. Okay? You can, at first glance, just say, well, Saul's just happy to get off the hot seat, right? But again, what's the deal? If David loses, he's losing for the entire army of Israel. So this is one of Saul's clearer moments here when he recognizes, you know what? This kid, he's got the goods. He really does trust God. And he's willing to let David go into the battle. Verse 38. And Saul armed David with his armor and put his helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with the coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. He tries to get them all decked out in the armor and the sword and all that. And David says, you know, I don't know how to use this stuff. It's not going to do me any good. All this is going to do is slow me down. So instead, verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. There they are. It's like, you know, I grew up on Westerns. I can just see it. You know, they're coming down the different sides of the town, walking down the street, coming right up to each other. Verse 42. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Disdained. He looked down at him with contempt. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves, with sticks? What, am I some dog? You think you're going to chase me away with some sticks and a couple of stones? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods, by the Philistines' gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Goliath here was like the first guy to do this trash talking stuff, right? he would have been right at home with Conor McGregor and the WWE and all those guys. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with the sword and with the spear and with the shield, real impressive. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. That's what he knew. See, David knew what his weapons were. He knew that it was God that was going to see him through and make him victorious. Wow. This day, verse 46, will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines, and take thine head from thee. And I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. He said, you're going to feed me to the birds and the beasts? I'm going to feed your whole army to the birds and the beasts. That's what he says. Verse 47. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with the sword and spear, for the battle is whose? The Lord. And he will give it into our hands. And he'll give it into your hands. The Lord doesn't need the sword and the spear. He doesn't need any of that stuff. God and you make a majority in every situation. And God, no matter what you're ever up against, God will cause you to be victorious. Verse 48. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hasted and ran the other way. No. That's what everybody else would have done. He hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He ran to meet him. He ran right into what everybody, I'm sure, considered, just sheer death. Those of a weaker stomach probably turned their head. His brothers probably, I can't watch this. I can't watch my little brother get just chewed up like that. And David, verse 49, put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. That stone came out of that slingshot with the velocity of a bullet out of a rifle. It sunk into his head. It didn't just knock him on the head and knock him out or knock him down. It sunk into his forehead. So David, verse 50, prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith, just to make sure he was really dead. He took the Philistine's own sword, and if you know the record of David, later on he gets that sword again, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And he takes it and cuts his head off. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they put up their hands in the air and said, okay, you guys win. We're your prisoners. That was the deal, right? No. They run. They fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sherem, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. They prevail, and David's victory inspires the whole army to then go and chase these guys down and chase them all the way back to Philistine and Philistia. And it's just such a tremendous record. It's not the record of just a boy going up against a giant. It's not just that a David and Goliath story, that some little guy can prevail over the big guy. Because it wasn't the little guy prevailing over the big guy. It was the little guy with his much bigger God prevailing over the big enemy. And that's the real inspiration. And that's the takeaway with this story. It's the same God. It's the same God. And, you may not run up against anybody that big. You may not have to do that kind of fight. But we all have those situations in life where it seems like we're fighting that giant, where it seems like we're up against something so overwhelming that we don't have a chance. And when you're up in that situation, remember what David remembered. Remember the God who is willing to fight your battle. God bless.